Ego's Elipsess. Chapter 1. The writer had lived a life that would have broken most people long before they reached her age. Yet she hadn't broken. She had bent, adapted, reinvented, and learned until she became a survivor in the purest sense. There was no pity in her solitude, no sorrow in her chosen seclusion. She didn't call herself lonely. What she missed most was her mother, the one person she still ached for. But the quiet wasn't emptiness, it was space, and in that space, the writer filled her time with crafts, skills, and projects, becoming a jack of all trades in the strangest ways. She was sweet underneath her steel, competitive when she cared, and carried with her both the scars of abuse and the armor it forged. But what truly set the writer apart was her mind. She was sharper than she let on, hiding her intelligence deliberately. Not out of shame, but as a strategy. Others found her easier to be around when she kept her brilliance tucked away like a secret knife. She liked it that way. Her cleverness was her own to wield, and she wasn't about to waste it making people comfortable. That stood in stark contrast to the other figure of our story, Grifty Nose. Where the writer was quiet and deliberate, Grifty was loud and sloppy. Grifty's lies had holes big enough to drive a wheelchair through, but she strutted through life as if she were the second coming of Machiavelli. She was not clever, but desperate to be seen as clever. She was not intelligent, but ravenous to be admired for it. Every scheme she pulled was half-baked, every con predictable, and every tantrum inevitable. She always got caught. Always. The writer didn't stumble into Grifty's world right away. She first found herself drawn into true crime through another infamous case, Chris Watts. That story lodged itself deep in her chest. A man who murdered his pregnant wife and smothered his 2 toddler daughters? The very thought was unbearable. The writer, who had raised a daughter of her own, knew the exhaustion, the frustration, the raw edges of motherhood. But to harm a baby, to kill your children, it was beyond comprehension. That case cracked something inside her, leaving her raw, heavy with emotion, and unable to shake the image of those little girls. So when the time came and Grifty's story spilled back into the headlines, the writer was already knee-deep in the world of true crime. Like most of America, she had watched the act on Hulu, the glossy dramatization of Dee Dee and her daughter. But something about it gnawed at her. The series was inconsistent, too neatly packaged, too polished to resemble reality. The more she thought about it, the less it made sense. That curiosity led her down the rabbit hole of YouTube, where countless creators dissected the details, presenting timelines, interviews, and theories. That's when the writer became fixated, not just on the facts, but on the strange spectacle of Grifty herself. The buck teeth fighting for dominance, the eyes pointing in 50 different directions at once, the over-the-top princess gowns she paraded in like a toddler forced into a pageant dress 2 sizes too small. The writer saw absurdity and danger wrapped into one tiny, conniving package. And she wasn't just an observer, she was an artist. Around this time, she had started experimenting with new forms of art, testing a graphics app that allowed her to mold stiff little avatars into something more alive. What others churned out as bland AI renderings, the writer sharpened into something uncanny. She sculpted the avatars until they resembled Grifty so closely it was unsettling. At first, she made static memes, simple, raw, biting images that ridiculed the absurdity of Grifty Nose. But quickly, these grew into animated shorts, jarring little cartoons that shocked audiences with their dark humor and bluntness. They weren't meant to be pretty or politically correct. How could they be? The crime itself was brutal, grotesque, and cruel. To sanitize it would have been dishonest. These animations weren't made for mass approval. They were an act of resistance. By then, Grifty had been released from prison after only 8 years, a staggeringly short sentence for a daughter who had orchestrated her own mother's murder. And now, society wasn't shunning her. They were elevating her. She was being worshipped, adored, treated like some twisted folk hero. That was the true horror. So the writer sharpened her pen into a blade and used her art to warn people. Grifty was not an innocent victim. She was a dangerous narcissist, a woman capable of decapitating her own mother, and now she was free to lurk in society. At the time, the GRBverse, the strange, sprawling online ecosystem devoted to Gypsy Rose Blanchard, wasn't fully formed. It was still congealing, chaotic, and raw. The writer, fueled by her outrage, defended anyone who was speaking the truth about Grifty. She forgot one of the oldest lessons. The enemy of your enemy is not your friend. Many of the content creators she allied with weren't motivated by truth or justice. They were motivated by money. They pretended outrage for clicks and views, pocketing the cash sent by fascinated suburbanites in America, the UK, and Australia. They lined their pockets with blood money while presenting themselves as moral crusaders. The writer didn't see it at first. It all felt new, fresh, and righteous. She was simply fighting the good fight, standing up against the worship of a monster. But in time, she would learn that even in the GRBverse, deception ran deep. The same games Grifty played with her mother were reflected in the creators who circled her story like vultures. And in that online battlefield, the writer would eventually have to reckon with betrayal, hypocrisy, and her own place in the fight. But first, there was Dan, the fairy in green glitter, and the tantrum that left BB holes carved across the walls of Dee Dee's home. If Grifty had been just another petty scam artist, a brat in a wheelchair collecting pity points and Disney tiaras, the story might have ended with her fading into obscurity. But Dan was the crack in the dam, the spark that lit the fuse. He wasn't her first man, not by a long shot. Grifty had been trolling online for any guy who would give her the time of day. Hornier than a mutt in heat, she'd lure them into her shed behind the house and play out her bizarre fantasies. Every single one of them bolted after realizing they weren't just dealing with a kinky girl in costume, but a delusional little possum already planning the wedding, the babies, and the white picket fence by the second hookup. These men, predators themselves, looking to exploit what they thought was a naive young thing, ran faster than cockroaches when the lights came on. Some deleted entire accounts just to escape her barrage of obsessive messages. But Dan was different, or at least Grifty thought he was. He wasn't just some online hookup. He was a costumed oddity, the kind of man you only encounter at the fringe of society. In one infamous photo, he's decked out in a green fairy costume, dusted head to toe in gold glitter like a drag show reject who took a wrong turn out of Neverland. That was the prize Grifty had her sights on. A glitter-soaked man-child whose only interest in her was the supply of stolen pain pills she smuggled out of her mother's prescriptions. It was transactional from the start. Dan wasn't in love. He was in it for the pills. And when Dee Dee, tired and sick herself, caught on to what was happening, she pulled the plug. She called their mutual friends, the same nerdy crowd Dan dressed up with for conventions, and exposed the situation. She told them Dan was screwing her buck-toothed, cross-eyed, rodent-faced daughter. And just like that, Dan was gone. No more pills, no more playdates, no more fairy glitter. And that was when Grifty lost it. It wasn't heartbreak, it wasn't grief, it was rage. Pure, entitled rage at being abandoned. Dan didn't stick around, not because he didn't know she was legal. He knew. He didn't stick around because he saw the crazy shining through, the danger he wanted no part of. And for Grifty, rejection was the one wound her ego couldn't tolerate. That fury curdled inside her and spilled out in ways that were no longer just manipulative. They were violent. The writer knows this not through speculation, but through evidence. She's seen the crime scene photos, BB pellet scars riddling the bedroom walls, the door frame, streaking down the hallway like breadcrumbs of madness. Dee Dee had run from her own daughter, through the house and into the living room, while Grifty chased her, unloading a BB gun as if it were an AR-15. The marks told the story clearly. This wasn't an accident. It was an assault. When Dee Dee landed in the hospital with BBs in her arm, she didn't tell the truth. She told police that they had been robbed in a Walmart parking lot. And if that weren't surreal enough, Grifty had the audacity to hijack her mother's Facebook account afterward. She wrote a post as if she were Dee Dee, gushing about how grateful she was for her little angel of a daughter, how wonderfully Grifty had cared for her during recovery, and how lucky she was to have such a sweet nurse at her side. The performance was grotesque, another layer in the endless con. This was more than manipulation now. This was sadism. Grifty wasn't content to use her mother. She wanted to torment her, to trap her in a cycle of humiliation. She left breadcrumbs about her escapades, little clues that hinted at the BDSM games she was playing with strange men, just enough for her mother to suspect the truth without being able to face it outright. Dee Dee tried to convince herself she was wrong, that her daughter wasn't the deviant creature she seemed to be, but deep down, she knew. That BB gun chase wasn't just another tantrum. It was the moment the line was crossed. The spoiled brat who once manipulated for sympathy became something far more dangerous. Dan was the catalyst, the rejection, the loss of control, the humiliation. Those were the accelerants that transformed Grifty from a conniving con artist into a budding psychopath. And the writer, years later, would hold these images in her mind as she crafted her art, as she pieced together the story that so many wanted to romanticize. While the world painted Grifty as a helpless victim in pink gowns, the writer knew better. She had seen the trail of BB holes, the lies typed out under Dee Dee's name, the shameless manipulation. The truth wasn't pretty. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was an ugly, glitter-soaked horror story, and it had only just begun.